I only have it as a decoy. It can't be, it doesn't do anything.
Order. Good morning and welcome to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. Today the committee is holding its fifth evidence session in our Transforming the UK's Evidence-Based Inquiry, and we will be considering some of the issues raised in the inquiry so far. And our witnesses this morning are spread across two panels. First we'll be hearing from Professor Denise Lievesley, CBE, who was commissioned to conduct a review of the UK Statistics Authority in June 2023 with the aim of establishing how the organisation is performing. And secondly, we'll hear from Baroness Neville-Rolfe, who is the Cabinet Minister, the Cabinet Office Minister responsible for this area. But first, if I could ask Professor Lievesley to introduce herself for the record.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you. I'm Denise Lievesley. I'm an applied social statistician.
Very much indeed. First question from me is a rather open-ended one, but can you tell us about how you conducted your review?
Yes. Well, as you mentioned, the review was commissioned last June, and I immediately began. We had a call for evidence, and we took evidence over the following few months in writing. We got evidence from about 30 contributors. But the main part of the review was really conducted through individual discussions with users and producers of statistics, both inside and outside government. I was very fortunate that fairly soon after the review was commissioned, I was anyway going to the World Statistics Congress in Ottawa. The World Statistics Congress is held every 2 years, and so I was able to go and speak to a number of statisticians from across the world. In addition to individual discussions, we held some roundtables where we focused on particular topics, and of course I attended a number of relevant meetings, including meetings of the UK Statistics Authority, the Regulation Committee, meetings of the staff of Office for National Statistics, the Government Statistical Service, and the Treasury, the OBR, etc. So a large amount of information gathering, a large amount of reading of relevant documents, in particular the number of reviews that have taken place previously. I mean, the review by Sir Charles Bean, of course, was really critical. But there have been other reviews too, one by Andy Garrett of methodology, for example, one of Patrick Sturgis, Professor Patrick Sturgis, focusing particularly on statistics in the COVID period. So a lot of gathering of material and then testing out ideas with going back to many of the same people. So it's been a few months of 7 months of gathering information and then trying to synthesize it.
Yes, and I should say I appreciated our conversation towards the beginning of your endeavours. I was grateful to have that input, and of course we made a formal representation as a committee. Yes. As well. Now, given all of that extensive evidence gathering, in general, how well or otherwise does the UK statistical system compare to those of other countries?
The universal view across other countries is that we're very, very highly rated, up in third, fourth, fifth of the statistical officers across the world. We're not seen necessarily as innovative as the Netherlands. There's issues sometimes with trust in the data that Canada seems to manage better than we do. There's issues to do with professionalisation of statistics that has managed extraordinarily well in France, for example. So countries have different strengths and weaknesses, but overall we're seen very, very highly. And I think our reputation went up during COVID because we were seen as being quite brave in stepping into needing just-in-time data. And it's quite startling that even richer countries, other OECD countries, were using UK data during that period because they didn't have data of their own. So our reputation is very high. Of course, when we were a member of the EU, we also had a very active role in Eurostat. And so we would be influencing a lot of the European statistical system. And one of the things we might want to discuss is how we replace that. So good reputation. And in particular, the Office for Statistics Regulation is envied. There isn't another country that has the equivalent of it. There are reviews taking place in a number of other countries, and Germany for one, and they have expressed interest in our Office for Statistics Regulation, which is seen as being a very important pillar in terms of trust in statistics.
Thank you very much. David Jones, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Professor Lievesley, I'd like to ask you a few questions about the impact of devolution upon your work and your review. During the course of this inquiry, we've heard from a number of witnesses about the challenges they face in comparing data produced by the four administrations within the United Kingdom. Were those concerns raised with you during the course of your work, and have you taken them into account in your review?
They were raised with me a great deal. We had a number of discussions about this issue, and of course I also spent some time in Scotland and in Wales, and on the telephone and Zoom calls with Northern Ireland. So it was a major part of what I was looking at. And as the government's response to my review has indicated, I have highlighted a number of the problems in achieving comparable data across the UK, but I'm sorry to say I don't have a magic solution to this. This is a difficult problem.
What are the factors that drive these challenges?
Well, I mean, I'm familiar with the problems in general because I used to be Director of Statistics in a UN agency, and the whole issue about how you get the balance right between data that is specific and relevant to the particular policies and circumstances of a nation or a part of a nation versus how you get comparable data that allows you to share information and learn from one another. It's a hard balance to achieve. It's becoming more difficult the more our statistics are reliant upon administrative processes, where often the administrative processes reflect different administrative systems, as they do in relation to health and education, for example, across the four nations. So it's becoming more difficult, not easier. And there are solutions. A partial solution is sort of post hoc harmonisation of administrative data, and that is carried out wherever possible. But a more radical solution would be, rather than using administrative data to collect data from specially designed statistical surveys, but that's expensive, and there are resource issues.
I mean, clearly we have to decide whether or not we're going to pursue the survey route or look at the operational data that are produced by the various administrations. Perhaps you could expand on what you've just said. What do you think is the best approach?
I think the best approach is to have a balance between the two. I'd like to take some of the political tension. I'm not making a party political point, but some of the political tension out of this. I always worry when statistics are used for naming and shaming rather than for actually learning and exploring. So I hope we'd get to that situation. I think the concordat across the nations is important, but we need more of a four-nation approach. There's suspicions, as I'm sure you're aware, in the three smaller nations that sometimes a UK solution is actually the English solution. So there needs to be respect and cooperation in that respect. But we also need to respect devolution in the sense that there will be data that aren't a priority for the UK, but are a priority in Wales or in Scotland or in Northern Ireland.
In terms of the citizen, though, it's surely important that he or she should be able to compare the service received in their part of the UK with other parts of the UK.
Absolutely.
And that is increasingly difficult, isn't it?
It is increasingly difficult, and it is important. And I do stress it is important. It is about getting a balance between the comparable data and the data that you need for the specific circumstances.
That's not a purely political point, is it?
It isn't. It isn't. And I hope that my proposal for a statistical assembly will help in this regard, because I hope that this will mean that we can actually engage quite openly and transparently as to what the priorities are and how we get the balance right between the locally specific data and the nationally comparable, the cross-nationally comparable data.
You mentioned earlier that an element of harmonisation might be appropriate. Is harmonisation of UK-wide data sufficiently resourced in your view?
In my view, no, it isn't. In my view, we do need more resources to be devoted to this. And there needs to be recognition of the importance of us having not just data so that we can compare ourselves across the 4 nations, but also data for the UK that we can compare with other countries. That's important too. So one of the impacts of not having a Scottish census at the same time as we had the English and Welsh census is it's much more difficult to get population data for the UK that is comparable to other countries. So, no, I don't think it is adequately resourced, and I think if you talk particularly to the statisticians in the 3 smaller nations, they would say they don't have the resources that they need in order to be full partners in the methodology that is needed for this.
So would increasing the resourcing of this exercise be something that you recommend to the government?
I haven't gone into a great deal of discussion about where the resources are placed, but I have said that I think more work is needed in this area, yes. So whether it's additional resources or whether it's a redistribution of resources is not something that I've addressed, but I do think more resources are needed, yes.
And overall, would you say that we should be concerned about the comparability or the availability of subnational data?
Concerned I think it can be improved, and I think there's work that is needed to try to ensure that we have a more coherent picture of statistics across the UK. I think efforts are going into it, and there is good cooperation between the national statisticians across the 4 national statisticians. Concerned, yeah. I think it is an area that needs more attention.
As a Welsh MP, I frequently have the issue of the comparability of health data raised with me. Are there any other areas which you would say are matters of concern?
Well, any area where the administrative systems are different are going to cause concern in terms of getting comparable data. So education, I certainly know about because my previous role was Director of Statistics at UNESCO. So I had responsibility for comparable education data, and that is problematic when education systems are different in the different countries. So I would say that it's probably in the social areas more than it is in the economic areas. There's more standardisation in the economic areas, and there's a greater role of the Office for National Statistics in terms of collecting the data and setting the standards.
Thank you very much.
Damien Moore, please.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Professor Lievesley.
Morning.
7 years on from the Digital Economy Act, which is intended to unlock access to data for statistical research purposes, why are there still such challenges in sharing data between government departments?
That's a really good question. That was one I was asking a lot. The legislation is essential, but it's not sufficient. And one of the difficulties we have is in a decentralised system is that data is being generated and owned by such a wide range of different parts of government, and that makes implementation much more complicated. Of course, we had the difficulty that the legislation didn't cover health and social care data, and they are fundamental to many of the social issues we want to address. One of my strongest recommendations is that the government really has to get a grip with this, that there needs to be a much greater understanding as to what we mean by data sharing and how we use it for research and statistical purposes. And in particular, and I say this coming from an academic background, there needs to be greater clarity as to how the academic communities can access integrated or shared data. We need to understand that most academic research in this country, a very high proportion of academic research, is fundamental to government policy, the implementation and the evaluation of government policy. And so it's really critical that we have good access. So I've learnt from other countries that legislation is necessary, but not the only factor, that culture is really important. I'm sorry to say that there are examples from other countries that are also struggling with this, even though they might have the legislation. For example, when I was in Canada, I learned that although statistics is a federal system, health is a provincial system, and therefore there were difficulties in terms of getting agreement to share health data, which is why they said, along with some other countries, that they used our data during COVID. And we are talking about what is probably respected as the best statistical office in the world. So it's not been resolved, but it's absolutely essential. And the more that we move into understanding that we want to integrate data from different sources, that the problems that we're facing are multidimensional, that health isn't separated from housing, from employment, etc., the more important this will become.
And so you've mentioned Canada particularly having a challenge, so the UK is not unique in that respect. But have you observed any countries where there's been a challenge and they've overcome that? Something we could look to? Well,
Australia was one of the earliest countries to actually develop the system of having legislation that gave the rights of the Statistical Office to utilise other data. So they made very fast change in that respect, and it went very well. I think they've struggled a bit with the issue about how you get private data sources in, but I think they've done very well in terms of getting government data into one integrated database. But I think one of the things that I struggled with a bit in the review was my review was about the statistical system, but actually sharing data is not just about statistics. Sharing data is absolutely essential in order that we can provide better services for the population. So that's one of the reasons why I highlighted that this is not just for the statistical system, and that's why I've thrown it back, if you like, to the Cabinet Office to say, look, where is the leadership in this area? Statistics is critical in this regard, but it's not the only user.
Just moving on to the use of private sector. So we often talk about the sharing of public sector data, but government statisticians are increasingly looking to private sector sources for their work. To what degree do you think official statisticians have been able to make use of legislative provisions to allow access to this private data?
I think that's only in its infancy, and there's a lot more work needed. And as we move to using more administrative data sources, I think it will be critical. I remember having discussions some time ago with the Irish Statistical Office that was making progress in this area. And then the progress halted because of issues over GDPR. So there are really quite complex structures in this respect. But I don't think we've yet got to a situation where we're utilising the rich data sources that we have across the UK most effectively.
And you've recommended in your report that the centre of government, led by the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, must actively work to resolve the systemic, often cultural barriers to data sharing between departments. What do you think this should look like?
I don't think it's for me to say. I think that goes beyond my review. I mean, it could be a really more senior person championing this. We have had championing of data coming from senior levels within government, but I think that the difficulty is that there still aren't the incentives in the system for statisticians, analysts and others who own the data, who see themselves as carrying all the risks but don't understand the benefits. So I think it's obviously a resource issue, but it's leadership, and it's really about concentrating on the benefits of data. Too often we focus on problems of privacy and so on without focusing on the benefits.
And just moving on, the ONS are currently developing an integrated data service on behalf of the government. What did you make of this service, and can it really work in light of what we've heard about the reluctance of departments to share the data they have?
It's not moving as fast as it should because of the reluctance. It's very interesting because the IDS has a programme review, and so I started off my review thinking that was sort of out of scope. It couldn't be out of scope because it's so fundamental to what's happening in the statistical system, and because so many of the users, both inside and government and outside government, said to me they had concerns that it isn't making the progress that it needs to make, and it is fundamental. Whatever the decision is for the next census, censuses at some point in the future won't be carried out in the traditional way. They will be carried out by bringing together and integrating data sources. And so the IDS is fundamental to that. And so as part of what the Cabinet Office and the Treasury do with respect to data sharing, I think there's also work needed by ONS in terms of better outreach, better clarity as to what that's for, better understanding of the incentive system for statisticians and others in the line ministries and the other government departments. We haven't made the progress in this regard that some countries have. I think every richer country, OECD country in the world, is going down this route and creating a similar thing to IDS. It's not unique. But some other countries just have a greater start because they have common identity numbers or population registers and so on. We really are at a disadvantage in this country in not having that. And that makes the whole issue of how you integrate data so much more difficult.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Joe Gideon, please.
Thank you. Professor Lievesley, over the course of our inquiry, we've been trying to understand whether the UK has a robust and transparent framework for identifying and prioritising demands for data. What's your view?
My view is that they don't. My view is that probably no statistical office across the world has a really good one. And that's why I'm proposing something that I have to admit hasn't been done elsewhere, but I think is needed, which is to have a statistical assembly that brings together users from across the 4 nations and within government and outside government in order to make much, much more transparent what the prioritisation is of the statistical system. I think it might be a fair criticism of ONS in particular, but maybe also some of the other government departments, that they're trying to do too much. Prioritisation is needed. But users, particularly those outside government, but strangely also some key users inside government, said they didn't know how the agenda for statistics was set. And they didn't know how they got their priority onto that list. That's very worrying. And so I just think we need a much, much more transparent process. And since I've proposed this and discussed it informally with people, there's a lot of enthusiasm. I think there's a lot of goodwill to actually help the statistical officers of this country become much more transparent in terms of how they set the priorities, and much more open, not just about what they will collect, but also what they won't collect. Because if they're transparent about that, it gives the opportunity for other organisations, UKRI, for example, to actually then decide where they're putting their priorities. So that's why I'm proposing a statistical assembly and a more open process. I'd like to see the UKSA have much higher visibility than it currently has. And so I think an annual lecture by Sir Robert Choate is really important. And in the process of giving that annual lecture, I think he can highlight the really important work that's being done by the Office for Statistics Regulation that I found outside of government wasn't always understood.
Okay, so you say what you're proposing hasn't been done before or elsewhere, but I just wonder, are there any other countries that have sought to identify and prioritise demands for data where we could take lessons?
I think we'd be a leader in this area with the Statistical Assembly, so I think other countries would be watching us and how we make it work, and I'm convinced we can make it work. There are other countries that have done more work in terms of registering what statistics are collected. So I'm thinking particularly of Sweden, where Statistics Sweden maintains a register as to what public data are collected and by what agency. And they maintain that register, and that's accessible for anybody, and it's a really good system for you to find the data that you're looking at for as a user. People within Stats Sweden said to me, one of the disadvantages of that register is it causes a certain amount of how should I say, sort of stodginess in the system. It's hard to make change because it's been captured and it's sort of set down in writing, which is one of the reasons why I was thinking you actually need a system of refreshing. You don't want to throw everything up in the air every 3 years, but you do need a system of refreshing and just stopping and saying, are we collecting the right things? Have we prioritised? one of the difficulties, I think, right across government is that new things get added, things don't get stopped.
We were surprised by the suggestion in the government's response to your review that government demands for data should take precedence over other demands. Do you share that view?
Don't. I was sorry to see that too. I don't agree with that phrasing. Of course, it's important for us to be assured that the government has got the data it needs for developing and evaluating policies, sound policies. Of course, that's important. But it's also important for me to have data that allows me to call the government to account. It's important for me to be able to have data that may be uncomfortable for the particular government of the day. And I think if you've got a system where the government data has precedence, in a resource-constrained environment, you could quite easily get to the situation where only the government data is collected. So, no, I don't think that's the right way of approaching it. It's also, if I might say, I don't think it's the current practice. So I haven't seen evidence that this is happening. I see evidence of a UKSA that is very conscious of external needs and tries to take account of them.
You touched on the use of statistics in public life. In some of our previous reports, we found that statistics can be misused in public debate. And we have recommended that the ministerial code be strengthened to encourage the appropriate use of evidence in public life. Is this an issue that you looked at?
It is an issue I looked at, and it is an issue of great concern to people who care about confidence in official statistics, who want a system that is trustworthy as well as is trusted and trustworthy, if I can put it like that. And so it is an issue I looked at, and I was aware that your committee had made a recommendation in the past that mindful of the code of practice wasn't sufficient, that it should actually be a requirement to comply. I know that the head of the UK Statistics Authority, Sir Robert Choate, feels similarly. I feel similarly, so I did include it in my observations.
Those were your findings, basically?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I wonder, Professor Lievesley, is there anything you would wish to add in terms of questions we haven't asked you, but anything you wish to add at this juncture? In summary, perhaps.
In summary, I think I should say that I spent quite a bit of time on the thorny issue about whether regulation and operation of statistics should report through to the same board, the UK Statistics Authority. You wrote to me about that. I started off the review thinking it should be separate. I ended up the review thinking it's actually working very well. And so what needs to happen is greater transparency and visibility of why the current system is working well, to reassure some of the users who are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Lievesley, for your time this morning and for sharing the findings of your view. We're grateful to you, and shortly we'll be hearing from the Minister, but for the moment, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Order.
Thanks.
Just check. Maybe outside. Indeed. The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently...
Order. We now move